Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right? All right. So my thesis paper is titled We Were the Sacrificed, Environmental Conquest as Religious Conquest in Linda Hogan's Power. So this is a fictional novel that we read this semester about a young Native American girl. My paper takes an eco-critical and post-colonial approach to the book. So some of the themes that I looked at were environmental conquest, and religious identity in the book. So to first kind of define some terms, when I talk about religious conquest, it usually has to do with missionary conquest, which is intentionally trying to oppress or destroy a religion, or it has to do with proselytizing, trying to convert somebody to a new religion. And environmental conquest is the act of stealing land, destroying land, or changing the land, which we'll talk about. Basically just the physical act of colonizing. And what my paper kind of seeks to accomplish is my thesis that environmental conquest is a form of religious conquest. So we'll get into the specifics of that. The book that I looked at was Power by Linda Hogan. It's about a 16-year-old girl, Omishto. She's a Native American and a part of the Taiga tribe, a fictional tribe in the Gulf of Florida. They live in the Everglades, and they worship Oni and Sisa, the wind and the panther. Omishto, the narrator, says that there's two people groups in her town. There's the Taiga people, the indigenous ones, and the white Christians who are settling in. And she's constantly being influenced by the pressures of both religions and cultures. The two biggest influences on her are Amma and her mother. Mama is a Taiga woman who has since converted to Christianity, and Amma is an indigenous woman who kind of lives between both societies. To give you a brief overview of the plot, after a great storm, Omishto follows Amma, an indigenous woman, into the woods following a panther. When they get close enough, Amma kills the panther, and Omishto is deeply upset and confused by this act, because not only is the panther sacred to their religion, but it's also endangered, and there are not many of them left. So after Amma shoots the panther, Omishto gets a closer look, and she can see that it's starved. And she considers maybe Amma killed this to put it out of its misery. But despite doing this, the panther is an endangered animal, and it was illegal to shoot it. So Amma is put on trial by the American courts as well as the Taiga tribe. And this is where Omishto has to testify to both courts and consider for herself the spiritual truth about what she witnessed. As this is happening, she's torn between this idea that, yes, Amma killed the panther, but really it was the destruction of its habitat because of modernization that killed the panther. So while this is a fictional story, it's in many ways representative of the reality of our American history. So my paper takes a four-part approach to this. I first look at Christianity and nature and their relationship, and compare it to the relationships between Native American religions and nature. Then I'll talk about types of environmental conquests that are seen in the book, and ultimately the impact on indigenous characters' religious identities. So the first part of my paper, just differentiating Christianity and Native American religions and their relationships with the environment. Christianity is different because it's a very portable religion, and I mean that it can go anywhere. It's not tied into specific landmarks. They don't worship the rain or the sun or any kind of specific animal. So really, in any way, the natural world is not essential to the preservation of that religion. And that really comes from the biblical origin story. Adam and Eve were in the garden, and they were told to conquer, inhabit, and subdue nature. And then a snake was the cause of sin and a fall from grace, and the belief that the earth is temporary and that the afterlife is eternal. So really, because of the Christian religion, we see a culture that's deeply concerned with matters of purity, cleanliness, separation of animals and people, and also the conquest of land. And this is demonstrated by the character Mama, who, after converting to Christianity, begins to subscribe to these Western views about purity and cleanliness. Omishto says that Mama has never grown accustomed to the dirt, mud, and clay of this place, even though she's lived nowhere else. She also says that her mother's catchphrase is, "Cleanliness is next to godliness." For the second part of my paper, I compared this to native religions. Most native religions share beliefs about the world being eternal, not temporary. And different from Christianity, native religions are not as easily portable. They're very connected to the physical world, everything from their rituals to the gods they worship. Even the way that they keep track of their religious and cultural history is all tied into place. In the book, Omishto exemplifies a lot of these ideas. When talking about the white preacher in her town, she says, "He thinks a snake is the devil, and the old ones think it is a god." Likewise, in regards to the taiga origin story, she says that mud and marsh are the origins of life. And lastly, we see the spiritual connection to nature that Omishto has when she uses this nature imagery to compare her physical body to her environment. She says, "Maybe like the land, there are rivers, mazes of canals, and swamps that run through my blood." So when we understand these differences, we can begin to see how the environment is a large part of the oppression of native religions. So for the third part of my paper, I'm going to talk about two types of environmental conquests in the book, and the first one has to do with landmarks. In the article, Educating America, Angela Cavender Wilson writes about the omission of Native voices in history, and she says that rarely is Native American history, from this perspective, concerned with dates and times. Rather, notions of place and homeland are given primacy, as it's this connection that's most closely linked with our sense of identity. So, in the book, as Omishto goes through her town and she kind of introduces her setting to the reader, she says that a lot of things that held cultural importance to her people have been renamed. For example, a road in her town was believed to be as old as the saber-tooths and mastodons, and they believed that the bones still lied under the road. But Omishto says, "Fossil Road is what we call it, although some people call it State Road 59. Similarly, a fountain called the Fountain of Immortality has since been poisoned by oil, and the native people can now only call it that ironically. She says, "It's polluted like all this land, and you can't even drink a cupful of that thin trickle of bad water." So while the renaming of roads and fountains doesn't appear to be this big religious offense, it's part of a history of disregarding Native American culture and their history, especially when we understand how Native American religions are tied into place, that they keep track of their history through place. To claim ownership and rename the land is to effectively rewrite a history. The second type of environmental conquest that I looked at does not just have to do with landmarks, but basically the blatant destruction of the environment. And this is really more post-modernization and industrialization, where colonization started to take on more environmentally destructive means. In the book, there are lots of examples of farming, paving highways, and buildings starting to destroy the Everglades. So I pulled this passage for you guys. Omishto says, "This is the year of wildfire in places that were swamp. The year Lake Okibuki was opened and the water level down here rose so much it drowned all the fawns. The wardens had to kill all the starving deer that were standing up to their necks in water. And it broke my heart to see the little deer with their white undersides lying along the high roads in a line, counted out and numbered as if they were nothing more than rocks or coins. I told my mom I was mad about it because it was the building and farming and sugar cane that was killing all the deer. She said, 'Why do you have to fuss so much about everything?' She thinks it's the small price that you pay for progress. I think it's the way to kill a world. That's how different we are from each other." So in the book, we can see these differences in characters. There's Omishto, who feels this spiritual connection to her environment, and her mother, who's since converted to Christianity, doesn't feel this connection to the same degree. But Omishto does, and it affects her. And there are many more examples in the book of modernization being responsible for environmental crises that impact Native people. And the most impactful one in the book is the death of the panther. When the panther's shot, Omishto sees it up close, and she says, "It has broken teeth, and fleas and ticks are still escaping the lifeless body. I can see its ribs. It was hungry, I say. And around the neck, the fur is all flattened, and it looks nearly gone, worn away." So because of the farming and building and nearby oil rigs and more, the habitat of the panther is destroyed. And Omishto says that this is what killed the panther long before Amma shot it. So when she has the opportunity to testify to both courts, she says this to herself: "Would they let me tell that sugarcane and cattle and white houses with red roofs had killed the land and the Panther people even before the storm? They are the true violators, that the cattle and houses we're passing are the beginning of this crime, and that their makers remain unjudged and untried." So we can observe throughout the book how environmental conquest is taking place in the form of appropriating landmarks, taking land, stealing it, and destroying ecosystems. And when we understand how native religions are intertwined with nature, we can begin to observe how environmental conquest is really a form of religious conquest. So the final part of my paper is looking at the impact on the identities of the native people. The environmental conquest in the book results in this split where characters have to make decisions about where they're going to fall, as taiga people or Christian people, white people or native people. Mama becomes a Christian, although Omishto says that she isn't sure that she's always sure about that decision. Amma becomes separated from her tribe, and Omishto chooses the old ways and is separated from her mother. And the tribe itself is becoming diminished and losing hope, and they're kind of sectioned off onto reserves. And they lose more of their land, and what's left of it is poisoned. In the book, Omishto says that the aftermath of our lives are bundled inside the wood of gone forests. And lastly, as she stands over the body of the panther, she says, "It's like the cut up land too. I see that this is what has become of us, of all three of us here. We're diminished and endangered." And lastly, about the taiga people, she says that we were the sacrifice, each one of us. Now that there are only 30 of us left in the world, we are hemmed in by sadness, living in a world that's become so foreign. And all of this is the result of the endangering of the panther, the destruction of the Everglades, the cornering off of native people onto reserves, and the rewriting of the landscape's history. And it's as Omishto said that this real crime of conquest has remained unjudged and untried. So, in conclusion, when all is considered, we have to acknowledge the role of the environment in religions and cultures. We have to acknowledge that environmental conquest, that is the taking of land, destruction of land, renaming of land, is a part of religious conquest, and it results in the destruction of religions and cultures. And in our modern day, as we consider things like reparations for Native Americans, when we consider how we want to teach history, when we think about what was taken and what was lost, we have to acknowledge that it was never just a matter of who gets what land, but that even nonviolent colonization, like this case, had a massive impact on Native religions. And we cannot continue to leave such a crucial part of our history out. So thank you for listening to me. And I hope that you read her book.